Hello, my dear students. For this term, we're going to deal and we're going to take a new novel. It's called A Tale of Two Cities. It's by Charles Dickens, one of our most famous novelists. The word tale, it means a novel. A novel, story, is a short story. And I mean by the word cities, it's like two kind of a countries or two cities, England and France, Paris and London. Usually in each and every chapter, I'm going to tell you about the setting, and I mean by setting, place, and time. Before I start, I want you to go and search in your own home for any kind of a small draft, a kind of a neglected notebook, and we're going to call it our private notebook. It's like our private dictionary. So I ask you to pick up the meaning of some English vocabulary words and just write the words and its meaning, okay? It's just like kind of a dictionary for your own self. Here are the words I ask you to go and pick it up from a dictionary. The words are revolution, crime, society, citizen, royal family, kingdom, republic, equality, fraternity, oppression, corruption, taxes, highwayman, tradesman, lack, tyranny, sacrifice, sell, like in prison, robber, poverty, humiliation, execution, luxury, aristocrats, inhumanity, oppressors, and rights. I give you 1 minute to copy down the meaning of each and every word. The setting, the novel, it only took place in England and France. That's all, England and France, London and Paris. And it was in the year 1775. When we start reading a new sort of a novel, we usually ask ourselves, what's the main idea of the novel itself? What's the plot itself? So it's a kind of a historical novel. It's not fictional, it's not scientifical, it's kind of a historical. The novel centers on the years leading up to the French Revolution. And the French Revolution took place in 1789. The novel focuses on the shameless corruption and inhumanity of the French aristocrats towards the poor class. The poor class who would reach like a boiling point since they had been oppressed for centuries and revolt against the upper class. In 1775, the conditions in England and France were horrible and usually they were the same. There were king and queen in France, ruling France, and it was king, we call it in French, Louis XVI, okay, or Louis XVI, and Queen Marie Antoinette. And also in England, they used to have king and queen ruling England, King George III and Queen Charlotte. In England and France in 1775, we have a classification of society, division of society, of community. It was classified into aristocrats, upper class, middle class, and low class. We're going to call them the mob. The aristocrats include the king, the queen, the church, the priest, the noblemen, okay? And they were living in luxury, imposing taxes on the poor class. They were completely heartless tyrants, caring only for their own interests. They treat the poor class as like slaves or animals. They were the elite who never pay taxes. As for the middle class, they were somehow the doctors. The low class, we call them the mob, or the poor class, they live in poverty, ignorance, misery, paying high taxes, humiliation. They have been like slaves, animals of the upper class. They have no sort of rights, okay? They were completely living in inequality and oppressions. Why would the poor class revolt against the upper class? Usually ask ourselves, why do you have a revolution? Why? For some sort of reason. The first one is that we are seeking or searching for equality, justice. We are searching for better living condition, for fraternity, for justice, like I said before, fighting and eliminating, ending any sort of corruption, oppression, seeking freedom and liberty. Who would revolt against who? Of course, the low class would revolt against the upper class. I just want you to remember that before the French Revolution, France was kingdom. And what do you mean by kingdom? It means it was ruled by king and queen. We don't have elections, we don't have rights to vote, we don't have the right to choose our president. They were called king and queen. And when the king and queen died for any reason, their sons will be kings and queen and so on. It's a kind of a succession or a chain. When the French Revolution had taken place, France had been converted or like changed from kingdom into republic. It means we have president. We don't have king and queen anymore. The aristocrats would be killed and executed in different ways, mainly by a machine called the guillotine. The English Revolution failed. It wasn't a successful one. That's why England, still up till now, it is a kingdom. And that's why we call it the United Kingdom. Here's the guillotine itself. Let me show you the photo for it. Here it is. It's like a sort of machine, as you see. People like kind of slaves, their hands were completely tied. They had to bend down, and their necks will be separated away from their own bodies. In 1775, usually we have a kind of like, say, a horrible conditions in France and a horrible conditions in England. Let's see the horrible conditions in France. First of all, high taxes led to poverty. Okay. Second is the king of France and the noblemen were concerned with their own pleasures only and money. Poor class were treated less than animals, okay, or even less than animals. For any simple reason, whatever it is, their hands were cut off, their tongues were torn out, or their bodies were completely burned alive. Poor people suffered from oppression, mistreatment, misery, corruption, inequality. At that time, there used to be a famous prison called the Bastille. The aristocrats could send anyone to the Bastille just by filling his or her name in what we call lettre de cachet. Lettre in French, it's like in English means letter. Cachet, it means like vanish or disappearance. Okay? That's the Bastille itself. And I ask you to log on the internet and search for more information about the Bastille, because it used to be a real kind of prison. It's not fictional one, it's a real one. How about the conditions in England at that time? At that time in 1775, there was lack, like we don't have safety or we don't have peace, and crime was spread every and each where in England. People used to walk across the street hiding their own faces and afraid of being known or recognized, and they may be shot or killed by any one of the highwaymen at that time. People used also to carry guns in fear of being shot at any time. The tradesmen in the morning were robbers at night. I mean, people who worked as merchants in the morning, they turned out to be highwaymen at night. Why? Because what they earn in the morning, they're going to be paid in form of high taxes to the upper class. So as a result, they will live in poverty, and they have a kind of a family to secure financially. So that's why they turn out to be highwaymen. When you used to travel outside of England for any reason, you're going to collect your furniture and hide your furniture in a department store in a place called the upholsterers, in fear of being stolen. And when you're going to come back, okay, you're going to take back your furniture. There was no order or protection, as daring robbers by armed men, I mean by armed people who have guns and weapons, took place in the houses and on highways. Prisoners in prison, they fought battles with jailers. The thieves cut, like they snatched the diamonds, necklace or jewels from around the necks of people at court. And for what kind of people? I mean from the upper class or the aristocrats. To travel from France to England in 1779, here we have a kind of a drawing or a map. England, London, you're going to take like a carriage going to a place called Dover. From Dover, a boat going to a place called Calais. From Calais, a carriage going to be inside France in Paris. Our novel begins in 1775, but we have to go 18 years back, like a flashback. If you're going to have a kind of like a sum or subtraction, you're going to be in 1757. We're going to start by knowing what happened 18 years ago. Also, at that time in 1779, I mean, there used to be a famous bank like Al-Ahli Bank, like Misr Bank, whatever we have in our country. There used to be a bank called Taliesin Bank. Taliesin Bank, like any bank, it has two kind of branches, one in England and one in France. Here are the major characters. We have Dr. Manette, Charles Darnay, or you can call him Darnay, Sydney Carton, Madame Deforge, Monsieur Deforge, Lucy Manette, Miss Pross, and Mr. Lorry. Let's subtract like 18 years. Let's go back 18 years back. We're going to be in 1757. I mean, before the beginning of our novel, about 18 years ago. There used to be a family called the Manette's family. Dr. Alexander Manette, he used to be a famous doctor, French doctor, that's his nationality. He lived in a place called Beauvais in France. His best friend was Mr. Jarvis Lorry, and he used to be like a clerk working in Taliesin Bank in France. His wife, we don't know her name, but simply she was, at that time, she was pregnant. His wife, she has a long golden hair and blue eyes. And I want you to memorize, that sort of information because it's very useful later on. Dr. Manette, he used to invest his money in Taliesin Bank in France. His servant, he has a servant, a little boy about 12 years old. His name was Ernest Deforge. Dr. Manette, for some reason, one day he was going back home. The servant came and told him, Dr. Manette, there is a man asking for you outside, and that man was completely dressed in black. The man, he told him, Dr. Manette, we had a sort of emergency and we need you right now. Dr. Manette, he went outside the house. His wife was so afraid. She asked him not to go, but he had no kind of fears. Once he went outside the house, his hands were completely tied, and he had been taken to prison, which is the Bastille, to spend his life over there for almost 18 years in the Bastille itself. Of course, the one who sent him, one of the upper class, one of the aristocrats. Why? That's the main plot of our novel, the climax. You're going to know later on in chapter 17, maybe, or 18. Dr. Manette spent in prison about 18 years. In the first 10 years, he still had a good kind of memory. He was in a kind of a solitary cell, in a cell alone. And the cell, it has a name, it's called, it's called 105 North Tower. What did he do, Dr. Manette? He simply decided to write his own diaries. He wrote his own diaries and he hid his diaries like behind a brick, like on a wall. And he wrote on the wall the first two initials of his name, AM, stands for Alexander Manette. 8 more years, and then he completely had a loss of his own memories. His own wife, she delivered a kind of a baby. She delivered a baby, and she was a kind of a girl, and she named her Lucy Manette. She looked like her mom somehow, and she was extremely gorgeous and beautiful. His wife, she kept looking for him until she decided that her own baby will grow up believing that she was an orphan. And she died of a broken heart. Mr. Lorry, the very intimate friend and the close friend of Dr. Manette, carried Lucy when she was about only 2 years old and carried her out, moved her out from France, going back to England. So she had been brought up in England. She lived all her life in England, and she had complete ignorance of her father still being alive. She believed that her parents had completely gone. She was brought up by her nanny. Her name is Miss Pross. How about Monsieur Deforge and Madame Deforge? Monsieur Deforge, the servant of Dr. Manette, he grew up to be like a man, a grown-up man, and he got married to a lady. Her name is Madame Deforge. Monsieur Deforge, he owned a wine shop in a street called Saint Antoine, one of the poorest sections ever in France. People who lived there, they suffered from hunger, sickness, and died of starvation. Deforge and his wife, they're going to be the leaders of the French Revolution, the organizers, preparing for it with the help of a group of people known as Jacks. Jacks, it is a sort of a title, not a name of someone. The Jacks, it's a secret name given to people who were preparing for the French Revolution, away from the knowledge of the French government. After 18 years, Dr. Matt had completely a loss of memory, so he had been released out of prison. Who found him? He was Monsieur Defarge. Monsieur Defarge, he took him to a garret, a room over top of the building in France, and he, let's say he took full care of him, and he sent a kind of like a notice or a letter to Telestin Bank referring and stating that Dr. Matt had been out of prison. That's the cell in a prison. We don't call it room, but we call it cell. Chapter 1, it's entitled The Times. In main points in chapter 1 is the opening paragraph itself, the conditions in France and the conditions in England. When you start just having the first page of the novel itself, you're going to find that part what you call the opening paragraph. Let's read it. It was the best of times, it was the worst of time. It was the age of wisdom, it was the age of foolishness. It was the time of belief, it was the time of disbelief. It was the season of light, it was the season of darkness. It was the spring of hope, it was the winter of despair. Why did Charles Darnley start his own novel by having a lot of contradictions or opposite words or contrasts or paradox? Simply to show us as the readers of the novel the gap between the aristocrats and the low class. In the novel, pages 11 and 12, you're going to find the conditions in France written, which we have just fully explained. I just want you to know that Lucy had no knowledge that her father was still alive and he had been released in terrible conditions. She believed that she was completely an orphan. Telestin Bank gave the task or the mission to Mr. Lorry to tell Lucy about the reality gradually. It was arranged that Lucy and Mr. Lorry would meet in France to receive her inheritance. And I mean by her inheritance, money left to her by her own parents. In France, Mr. Lorry would reveal the whole reality to Lucy Manette, that she had no kind of inheritance, that her father was released, that he was still alive, and so on. Mr. Lorry would get ready to leave from England to France to meet Lucy Manette, as well as Lucy would travel alone with Miss Pross to meet Mr. Lorry in France, and that's going to be plan number A. And when I mean plan number A, you're going to still have more and more plan. Now it's time to move on to chapter 2 and gain more information about the events and the characters. Well, that's all, and thank you all, dear students.